Get out of my house, you miserable old woman. That's what my son-in-law screamed at me. In my own kitchen. In the house I've owned for 31 years. And my daughter, my own flesh and blood, stood right there by the stove and said nothing. Not one word. I want to tell you what happened next. But first you need to understand something about me. I'm not a pushover. I raised 2 kids on my own after my husband passed away from a heart attack when I was 43. I kept the house, kept my job at the school board, paid off the mortgage early. I'm not the kind of woman who gets walked over. Or at least, I never thought I was. My name is Vivian. I'm 68 years old. I live, or I used to live, full-time, in a 3-bedroom house in Barrie, Ontario. The kind of neighborhood where people still shovel their neighbor's driveway without being asked. I moved there in 1993, right after Robert died. I wanted somewhere quieter. Somewhere I could raise my daughter Cassandra and my son on a teacher's salary without drowning. Cassandra was always the difficult one. I say that with love, but it's true. Smart, stubborn, impatient. She met her husband, I'll call him Marcus, at a conference in Toronto when she was 29. He was charming in the way that some men are charming when they need something from you. The first time he came to my house for Christmas dinner, he rearranged my spice cabinet because, in his words, it was inefficient. I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. They got married in 2019. Small ceremony, which I paid for most of, though nobody ever said thank you directly. Then COVID hit and everything got strange for everyone. I won't dwell on that part. What I will tell you is that by the fall of 2022, Marcus had lost his position at the logistics company he'd been working for, and Cassandra's freelance work had dried up considerably. They were renting a condo in Vaughan. $2,400 a month, and they were struggling. Cassandra called me on a Thursday evening in October. I remember because I was watching the news and there was a bad storm rolling in off Georgian Bay. She was crying, or close to it, and she said, "Mom, we're in real trouble. We don't know what we're going to do." I asked her what kind of trouble. She told me they were 2 months behind on rent, that Marcus had a job prospect in the new year but nothing confirmed, that they needed somewhere to stay, just temporarily, just until things stabilized. She said 3 months, maybe 4. She said she hated to ask. What was I supposed to say? I told her yes. Of course I told her yes. Of course I told her yes. She's my daughter. I cleared out the guest room, which I'd been using as a sewing room, moved my machine and fabric bins to the basement, put fresh sheets on the bed. I even bought new towels for the bathroom. I was glad to do it. I thought it would be nice, honestly. A little company. The house had been quiet since my son moved to Calgary 3 years before. They arrived on a Saturday with 2 carloads of stuff and a moving truck they'd hired for the furniture they couldn't leave behind. I hadn't realized they were bringing furniture. I stood on the front porch watching Marcus direct the movers and thought, well, they're planning to be comfortable, aren't they? The first few weeks were fine. A bit crowded, and Marcus had opinions about where things should be in the kitchen, but I let it go. He was stressed. Cassandra was stressed. I was trying to be understanding. But something started shifting around December. Small things at first. Marcus began making comments at dinner about how the house was underutilized. He said things like, "You've got all this space, and it's basically wasted." I asked him what he meant. He said, just that the layout could be so much more functional if you opened it up a bit. I said I liked my layout. He laughed. Not in a mean way, not yet, but in that dismissive way, the way that says your opinion isn't really being considered. By January, he'd started working from the basement. He set up a whole office down there without asking me, moved my storage shelving to one side, brought in a standing desk, a ring light, a monitor. I came downstairs one morning and nearly didn't recognize my own basement. When I said something to Cassandra, she said, "Mom, he needs a proper workspace. You weren't using it." As if my belongings in my basement were the inconvenience. That's when I started feeling it. That particular feeling. Like the ground underneath you is soft in a way it wasn't before. In February, Marcus got the job he'd been waiting for. A senior operations role at a supply chain firm, fully remote. Good salary. I didn't know the number, but Cassandra seemed relieved, and Marcus was more relaxed, more expansive. I thought, now they'll start saving, now they'll look for a place. But they didn't start looking. Spring came. I planted my garden like I do every year. Tomatoes, zucchini, herbs along the south fence. One afternoon in April, I came home from my aquafit class and found Marcus standing in the backyard with a man I'd never met. They were looking at the fence line. I asked what was going on. Marcus said, "Oh, this is my buddy Craig. He does landscaping. I'm just thinking about what we could do back here." I asked what he meant by what we could do. He said, make it more livable. Maybe a deck, some garden beds. I said, I already have garden beds. And I'd appreciate if you didn't invite people to assess my property without telling me. He looked at me for a second like I'd said something unreasonable. Craig left. Marcus didn't apologize. I talked to Cassandra that night. I said gently, I thought, "Honey, I need you to talk to Marcus about boundaries. This is still my house. He can't just make plans for it without my input." She said she talked to him. She looked tired. I felt for her. I did. Nothing changed. By May, they'd been living with me for 7 months. I started asking carefully about their timeline. Cassandra said they were saving up, that with rental prices in Ontario being what they were, they needed more time. She wasn't wrong about rental prices, but I noticed they'd also started buying things. A new couch for the living room. Their old one was too small, apparently. A new television for the guest room. Little luxuries here and there. Meanwhile, I was practically tiptoeing around my own home. In June, Marcus asked if they could convert the dining room into a second office. He said Cassandra needed a dedicated workspace too. I said no. It was the clearest no I'd said since they moved in. He said, "It's just a room, Vivian." I said, "It's my room, in my house." He looked at me with something cold in his eyes and said, "Most parents want to actually help their kids." I didn't sleep well that night. What I didn't know then, what I only found out later, was that Marcus had already started researching what rights a long-term houseguest has under Ontario law. He'd been reading about occupancy rights, about how difficult it can be to remove someone who's established residency in your home, even without a lease. He knew. He'd known for months. And while I was trying to be reasonable, trying to be the understanding mother, he was building a case. July was when things got ugly. He stopped being polite, or maybe he'd just stopped pretending. He began commenting on my habits in a way that felt deliberate, sighing loudly if I was in the kitchen when he wanted to use it, complaining about the television being too loud, making remarks about how I undercooked things. Once, he told me the house smelled like old lady stuff. I looked at him and asked him to repeat himself. He laughed and said he was joking. He wasn't joking. Cassandra started echoing him. That was the part that broke something in me. She started finishing his sentences, agreeing with his complaints, looking at me with this expression I can only describe as embarrassed. Not embarrassed for him, but embarrassed of me. Her own mother. I called my friend Barb. I've known Barb since our kids were in kindergarten together, and I told her what was happening. She came over for coffee one afternoon while Marcus was at a networking event in Toronto and Cassandra was at a yoga class. I showed Barb the basement. I showed her the new furniture they'd bought. I told her about the dining room request, the property assessment, without my permission. Barb said, very quietly, "Vivian, you need to talk to a lawyer." I said, "Barb, he's my son-in-law." She said, "I know who he is." Talk to a lawyer. I didn't do it right away. I wish I had. I spent another 3 weeks trying to have reasonable conversations with my daughter that went nowhere. I wrote things down, dates, incidents, what was said. I don't know exactly what made me start doing that. Some instinct. I put the notebook in my car in the glove compartment where I knew they wouldn't find it. The beginning of August was when I found the papers. I was looking for a file I keep in my home office, a small room off the hallway that I'd made clear was not for their use. The door had been closed, but not quite latched. I pushed it open and my desk, had papers on it that weren't mine. Marcus had been using my office, and among his papers, sticking out from under a folder, was a document I recognized the format of, but couldn't quite process at first. It was a land transfer document, with my address on it. My name was on it, but so was Marcus's, and the date was recent, and my signature was on the bottom line. I did not sign that document. I have never signed that document. I stood there for I don't know how long, holding it, reading it again. I took a photo of it with my phone. Then I put it back exactly where I found it, I walked out of that office, got my purse and my car keys, told Cassandra I was going to run some errands, and drove straight to Barb's house. I sat in her kitchen and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. She made me tea. She looked at the photo I'd taken, and she said, "Vivian, this is fraud. This is criminal fraud." We found a lawyer the next morning. She was a family and estate lawyer with an office on Dunlop Street. I showed her the photo. She made some calls. Within 48 hours, we had confirmed that Marcus had attempted to file a fraudulent title transfer on my property, a transfer that, thankfully, had not yet been processed by the Land Registry Office because of a technical discrepancy that had flagged it for review. We were lucky, extraordinarily lucky. My lawyer told me very clearly what my rights were. I owned that house outright. They had no lease. They had no legal claim to occupancy beyond a reasonable notice period. We prepared an official notice of termination of occupancy, giving them 30 days, which in Ontario is standard even without a formal lease. And she advised me to contact the police regarding the attempted title fraud. I went home that afternoon. Marcus was in the kitchen making himself a sandwich. Cassandra was on the couch with her laptop, and I stood in the doorway and I said, calmly, because I had decided to be calm, "I need to speak with both of you." They looked up. Something in my face must have told them this was different. I said, "I know what you tried to do with my house." The color left Marcus's face. Cassandra looked at him, not at me. I said, "You will both be receiving formal notice from my lawyer tomorrow morning. You have 30 days to vacate this property. I've also spoken with police about the title transfer document." Marcus stood up. He was trying to look confident, but he looked frightened, and anger always comes from fear in people like him. He said, "You have no idea what you're talking about. That document was just." I said, "Don't." He started raising his voice. He said I was paranoid, that I'd never understood his intentions, that he had been nothing but good to me. He said I was a bitter old woman who didn't know how to be a real family. He was getting louder, and then he said it. The thing I told you at the very beginning. He looked right at me in my own kitchen and he said, "Get out of my house, you miserable old woman." Cassandra said nothing. I looked at him for a moment. Then I picked up my phone, called Barb, asked if I could stay with her for a few days. She said yes before I finished the question. I packed a bag. Not because I was giving up my house. I want to be clear about that. I packed a bag because I knew I needed to let the legal process work, and I didn't feel safe in that space with him in that state. I had taken my important documents, passport, ownership papers, financial records, to my lawyer's office 2 days earlier, as she had instructed. I drove to Barb's. I found out what happened next through my next-door neighbor, Ruth, who texted me that evening. Ruth is 71 and has excellent vision and no tolerance for nonsense. She said she could hear music from my backyard. She looked over the fence. Marcus and Cassandra were outside with a bottle of something, and she could hear Marcus saying, "She's gone. We've got the whole place to ourselves." Cassandra was laughing. Ruth took a video. I have that video. My lawyer has a copy. The police have a copy. The 30-day notice went through. Marcus tried to challenge it. He consulted someone, probably a legal aid line, about squatters' rights and long-term occupancy. But they hadn't been there long enough, and they didn't have a signed lease, and the attempted fraud actually worked against any claim of good faith residency. My lawyer handled it. I'm not going to pretend it was simple or fast. There were 2 weeks of correspondence and one very tense exchange of voicemails, but it held. They left on a Wednesday morning in September. Ruth let me know when the last car pulled out. I came home that afternoon. The house smelled like their laundry detergent and takeout food and something I couldn't identify. I opened every window despite the September chill. I stood in my kitchen for a while and didn't do anything, just stood there. My kitchen, my floors, my view of the garden still going even in late season, the tomatoes still fat and red on the vines. Marcus was charged with attempted fraud. He pled down to a lesser charge eventually and received a conditional discharge, meaning no criminal record if he stays out of trouble for a year. It's not the outcome I'd have chosen, but my lawyer said it's common in first offense fraud cases in Ontario. He and Cassandra have since moved to Hamilton. Cassandra and I haven't spoken. I don't know if we will. That part is the hardest thing to write, and I've thought about how much to say. She's still my daughter. I don't know how much she knew, how early she knew it, whether she was complicit from the beginning or whether she got pulled along. I've asked myself that question every week since. There are days I want to call her. There are days I'm so angry I can't think straight. What I do know is this: I should have called a lawyer the moment I found that landscaper in my backyard assessing my property without my permission. I should have trusted the feeling in my stomach, that soft, uncertain ground I described earlier than I did. It's not weakness that made me wait. It's love and hope and the deeply human refusal to believe that someone you raised could be building a case against you. But love does not require you to be someone's opportunity. My house is mine again. I had the locks changed that first afternoon. I painted the guest room a color called warm pebble, which is a sort of soft taupe, and it's now my reading room. The sewing machine came back upstairs. My spices are arranged in whatever order I want. Last Tuesday, Barb came over for dinner and we sat out back as the sun went down. The garden was winding down for the season but still beautiful. She raised her glass and said, "To your house," and I said, "To knowing when to stop waiting." If you're watching this and you have family living with you, I'm not saying be suspicious. I'm not saying assume the worst of the people you love, but know your rights, write things down. And please, please listen to the feeling that tells you something is wrong. I learned to listen, just a little too late and just barely in time. I've thought a lot about what made Marcus believe he could do what he did, not the legal mechanics of it. I understand those now better than I ever wanted to, but the deeper thing, the belief that I wouldn't notice, or that if I noticed, I wouldn't act. He had watched me be accommodating for nearly a year. He had watched me move my sewing machine to the basement without much protest. He had watched me accept his landscaper friend in my backyard with only mild objection. He had watched me try over and over to have calm conversations with my daughter that went nowhere. And somewhere in all that watching, he decided I was someone who could be managed. That was his mistake. Not the forged document. That was the crime. His real mistake was misreading patience for weakness. There's something I want to say carefully here, because I don't think I'm unusual. I think a lot of people in my position, parents, people who love deeply and accommodate generously, get misread the same way. Kindness looks like softness to certain people. The willingness to give looks like an inability to take back, and so the line gets pushed and pushed again, and the person doing the pushing tells themselves a story in which they are simply taking what was always available. Marcus told himself that story. I think Cassandra helped him tell it. What changed everything wasn't courage exactly, it was evidence. The moment I held that document in my hands and understood what it was, something in me became very calm and very clear. That clarity is what I want to talk about because I think it's something that lives in all of us. That moment when you stop explaining yourself and start acting. You can't manufacture it early. You can't borrow it. It arrives when the situation finally becomes undeniable, and when it arrives, you have to move fast. I moved fast. I took the photo. I called Barb. I found a lawyer. I protected my documents before they could disappear. Every one of those steps required a decision, and every decision required me to accept something painful. That my daughter was not going to save me, that waiting any longer would cost me more than the discomfort of acting now. That's not a small thing to accept, but accepting it was the only intelligent response to what was actually happening as opposed to what I had been hoping was happening. The actions Marcus took came back around to him in the most direct way possible. He used my trust against me, and that same trust, the paper trail, Ruth's video, my notebook in a glove compartment, became the evidence that dismantled his case entirely. What you build on dishonesty cannot hold, not because the world is watching, not because there is some force keeping score, but because deception requires constant maintenance and the truth requires none. Eventually, the maintenance fails. And Cassandra, I don't know yet how that story ends, but I know that every choice she made, the silence, the echoing, the looking away, was a choice she made with full knowledge of who I am and what I had given her. Those choices belong to her. My grief about them belongs to me. I can hold both of those things without letting one collapse into the other. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's simpler than it might sound. Know what you own, know your rights, and write things down. Not because you should expect the worst from the people you love, but because your security should never depend entirely on someone else's goodwill. That is not pessimism. That is the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and in the long run, for the people around you too. My house is mine. My garden came back this spring, better than last year. And I am, at 68, still learning what it means to take up exactly the space I've earned.